if I'm a buyer, sorry, but I don't care about motion design. I don't care about the tools you use, but what I do care about is, what does it do? Like, does it convert my customers? That's why motion design as a thing is not something you sell. It's the results and outcomes that it enables that you sell.
All right, so Joel, 2024 was a strange year. I kept trying to figure out, is this a good year? Is this a bad year? And, everyone listening to this, if you heard the end of the year podcast, you may have noticed that we got very different answers from people. So I wanted to start by just throwing this at you. What the hell happened last year?
Okay, well, I'm going to say this. I think that 2024 was rough, but it was really simply the aftershocks of 2023. Because 2023, from my vantage point, was actually a lot worse. It's just that in 24, things didn't fully bounce back. Okay. They're starting to, but I think 24 was just the the ripples of all of the crap that had happened in 23. So that's my short answer.
Let's dig into this a little bit. I have my theories. I've thought about it a lot of why the economy did so bad in 2023 and why it continued to kind of sputter along last year. And there's obviously multiple factors, but I'm curious, what do you think the primary drivers of that were?
Oh man. Okay. I have a top 10 list. If you're game.
Nice. I was going to ask you for 3, but 10 works too.
So this is something I've been sharing at these founder dinners that I host, because I read off this list and I say, hey, everyone, give me a name for this list. And the list goes something like this: war, inflation, the Hollywood strikes lingering malaise, the no more zero interest rate free money policies, the post-COVID screens fatigue, the glut of content where we're obsessed with novelty over quality, the rise of influencers, okay, the trend towards in-housing, election uncertainty. Okay, we can finally knock that one down. And then the final one is 20 new studios launch every day. So that might give you some sense of there is no one simple answer. There's not even 3 simple answers. There's a lot of complexity into why 23 and 24 were so challenging. So which of those do you want to unpack?
Well, why don't we try to look at it this way? So some of those things, you can trace a straight line from, the COVID years and sort of the response to that and the fiscal policy during that, sort of inflating a lot of things and creating this bubble, to, the economy and inflation and zero interest rate policy going away, right? But some of those things are like longer term trends, right? Like the rise of influencers and more content and all that kind of stuff. So how do you sort of weigh those things in your mind in terms of, the amount of impact that they had?
Oh man. Well, I mean, the way I think of it overall is there's a classic saying that markets hate uncertainty. So when there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, markets are flat or down. Okay. And then as certainty increases, investors start to gain confidence and they start to invest, they start to borrow, people start to spend. That's probably the biggest thing I would say is overall, I would say as when we enter into times of uncertainty, that's the time to sort of batten down the hatches and make very shrewd moves. Don't overspend, don't overinvest. And then as things start to loosen up, then you can start to place more bets, take more risks. But, the smart person is looking for those signals and those leading indicators, not just looking for the news of like, oh, Bitcoin is at an all-time high. Like that's not the time to go and invest in Bitcoin.
Yeah. So, and some of these things are cyclical too, right? So, I'm thinking about in-housing, right? So you said that was one of the factors here, is that a lot of brands are bringing their creative in-house. And that, I remember when that happened, almost 20 years ago. And and it kind of had similar effects, but then it seemed like it kind of went the other way for a while, and now maybe we're coming back in house. So how many of those things do you feel like are cyclical, and we can sort of semi-confidently predict that, like, okay, if we wait long enough, they will kind of go back to some baseline?
I think they're all kind of cyclical. I mean, unfortunately, war is cyclical. Inflation is cyclical, right? Strikes and layoffs are cyclical. In housing, totally. I know exactly what you're talking about. That is a pendulum that swings back and forth. But that said, I also would caution people by saying that the good old days aren't coming back. So for anyone that thinks, oh, the pendulum is just now it's gonna someday swing back, it doesn't ever swing back to where it was. What happens is when things, quote, swing back, there's a new normal. And we all say, oh, that's what happened, right? Because hindsight is 2020. So just know this, that like when in housing right now, I would say is actually not a bad thing. It's not oh no, all the work is going away. The work is changing. And if you're listening and paying attention, there's actually great opportunities there, even though on the surface, it looks like, oh crap, the pendulum is swinging back away from us.
Right. What did you mean by the good old days when you said the good old days are not coming back?
There have been several, in my career. I guess I would say I'm old enough in this industry that I've seen several good old days. Okay, so for example, back in the late 90s, right? If you could render a spinning 3D cube, you got the work. Like you got the job, you charged 5 or 6 figures, you were one of the 20 companies in the world that could do that. And those were the good old days because we were doing animated spots for agencies and for Super Bowls and all these kinds of things. And it was amazing. And then in the 2000s, the digital and desktop revolution, everything totally annihilated the good old days. And you know what? The good old days never came back, but something else did come back and replace it. And there was the good old days of the mid and late 2000s until the recession hit. And then, right? So there's these trends, but the good old days are just when I say there's these heady times, like when COVID was the second half of COVID, right? The demand for content and motion and animation, all that just exploded. Glory days, good old days. And guess what? They're not coming back.
Right. Interesting. And so then the game becomes trying to figure out what the next good old days, the future good old days, what that's going to look like. We're going to keep coming back to this, but do you have a sense of what it might look like? I mean, in the end of the year podcast, I asked every guest to kind of make some predictions about next year. And people made predictions, but they were a lot less certain than they've been in previous years. I think there's still this feeling of like, and I think AI plays into that. We haven't even mentioned it yet. And so do you have any vague vision of what it might look like when it is the good old days again?
It's going to be very vague and general. I'm going to say this. I'm going to say brand direct. Okay. That the buyers who were buying from us in the good old days have changed, and the new buyers are the brands. So I'll maybe just drop that as a tease because I think you and I are going to get into that more as this conversation goes along. But that's where, again, that's very broad, maybe not vague. That's very broad. So yeah, how we're going to move into that direction. Yeah. I look forward to getting into some more of those details.
Yeah. So one of the best answers that someone gave in our end of the year podcast was Erica Gorochow from Pep Rally. And she said something to the effect of, she feels like now motion design is just design. And you said something like, forget about motion design as a service. And, our mutual friend Haley Akins has talked about this idea that, you even using the term motion design, it doesn't resonate with clients the way it used to. They're not looking for motion design. They're looking for something maybe more specific that happens to be built using motion design tools, but they don't think of it in that way. Do you have any thoughts on that? Are we kind of at the beginning of, maybe just a new era of motion design where it really isn't motion design? It's not this cottage industry anymore.
Yeah, I think what happened is when motion design was, we'll call it invented, okay, in the early 2000s, maybe, that it was this bright, shiny object. And for the people who heard about it and saw what it can do, they were like, oh my God, I need that. But fast forward to today, do you know this analogy you hear marketers talk about? That if you were selling a power drill, you might see the box on the shelf and it talks about all the features of, this many RPMs and it's cordless and whatever. It's super reliable. And the buyer is actually just sitting there thinking, you know what? I don't care about your stupid drill. I just want a 1/4 inch hole. Okay. Similar thing with motion design. If I'm a buyer, sorry, but I don't care about motion design. I don't care about the tools you use. I don't care about whatever all the little sexy bells and whistles of that are. But what I do care about is what's the 1/4 inch hole that motion design is going to make for me? Meaning, what does it do? Like, does it convert my customers? Does it, stir up a movement? Does it, I don't know, impress my investors, make me look good and help me get a promotion? Like, that's why motion design as a thing is not something you sell. It's the results and outcomes that it enables that you sell.
Right. I want a viral video for my brand. I don't care that you're really good at Cinema 4D and After Effects. I want a viral video. Is that kind of the idea?
Yes. And then, of course, if I'm a very shrewd seller who runs a studio, I would say, and why do you think you need a video? And why do you think that's going to get you the result you want? But that's a whole nother story.
All right. Well, I want to talk about, the some of the studios, because you work with a lot of studios, right? You've got this amazing network of founders. And so you must hear, I do notice, and we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, that there's a certain type of sentiment that people tend to post online. And then there's this other type of sentiment that they just bury. But I bet you hear those sentiments, when things are dark and, and they're not sure if the lights are going to be on in a month, they probably are comfortable talking to you about that. So what did you notice about the studios, that over 2020, maybe 2023 is an anomaly where kind of everyone was down. But in 2024, some studios still did okay and some didn't. Was there anything you noticed, the ones that didn't do well, where you thought, if only they'd done this, I think they would have done well?
Yeah, I did one of my founder dinners. I call these things Fuse. And this was about 2 or 3 weeks ago in New York. And one of my guests was my good friend, Amanda Russell, who's one of the partners at Cream. And yeah, great person. And she said something interesting, and I'm going to loosely translate it. And it was the people that struggle, I think, were the ones who didn't stand for something. Okay. So think of the studio where it's almost like they are telling the whole world, yeah, we can do that. So, right, like we can animate and we can design and we can make cool things and we can edit. And that overall mindset of, yeah, we can do that isn't compelling. It's not interesting because buyers, clients, they don't care what you can do because guess what? Almost everybody can do it. The question is, what is it that you do that is really special, really interesting, very, provocative, valuable? Okay. I can put all kinds of superlatives out there. So the opposite of this sort of not standing for something is picking a lane and going all in and totally owning this position, this message, this attitude, right? Like I'm thinking of one of my other guests at that dinner was Barton Dahmer from...
Already been chewed, yeah.
Yeah, okay. If you go to that studio and guess what? If you hang out with Barton, you're like, wow, it's a lot. Like the vibe, the attitude, the work, everything, it has got this aggressiveness, this leaning forward, this elite and high fashion, high stakes, whatever sort of energy to it. Like that is not a studio that's just telling everybody, yeah, we can do that. And you kind of know what you're getting and you reach out to them and you hope that they are going to take your call. You hope that they, right, have space on their calendar for you. So that's a bit of again, there's a lot of moving parts, but that's probably one of the biggest things that I would say is what causes studios to struggle in times like last year and this year.
That's really interesting. So I've met Barton a couple times. EJ knows him really, really well. And I think he was a skateboarder. So when I look at their website and their work, some of that ethos kind of comes through. And so when you said that, the studios that did well or did better stood for something, my first thought was, oh, do you mean like they have a message we're going to make a social justice positive impact in the world? But then you brought up Barton, and really the way I see it from the outside, you would know better, is his studio is almost an extension of his personality and his own personal brand in a way. Obviously like the studio, it just sort of, it mirrors what he probably already is inside. And so my question is that type of standing for something that a studio who's struggling and looking to do that, can they manufacture that? How do you even figure out what that is, what you stand for, if it's not something obvious? Like, I think Bien's a good example. They have this, what do they call it? Inclusive motion design, right? Like that's an obvious thing they stand for. Then there's other, there's probably other examples. But Already Been Chewed's a really interesting one. So yeah, that's my question. Can you manufacture that? Can you just create that whole cloth, or do you need to have that already and then just expose it?
I don't think you can manufacture it. It's more of what I would call a getting in touch with and then manifesting it and expressing it. So if you're a studio that's, I don't know, let's call it more than 50 or 100 people, it's a very different conversation. So let's say this is for the smaller studios, okay? The smaller studios, I think you nailed it, that are run by folks like Barton. They really are this extension of the founder or the leaders, let's call it the leadership team. So you might have a superstar creative director, a very, controversial founder, someone like Barton, who's just super opinionated and a strong personality. That getting in touch with and getting clear about what the values, the mission, the purpose, right? All of that those people believe, it really gets to their core beliefs, and then expressing it in a way that comes through the studio's brand and through their messaging, the way they show up on social media, what they talk about when they're on podcasts, all of that creates this very compelling, like, wow. Okay. Wow. I am interested. I know what I'm getting when I go to that. Whereas I could probably, I won't name names, but I could name 20 studios right now that really don't stand for anything. They just stand for this, we do cool work. And they're unfortunately quite bland and boring in today's market.
This is really getting me thinking, Joel. So, okay. So, I'm trying to think of other examples, because there's like Ordinary Folk might be a really good example if you're familiar with them. So, that studio really is, I think, an extension of Jorge, the founder. And, they have they have like the Bible Project on their portfolio, and all of their copy is really warm, and it sort of like lets you in, to the ethos that they have, right? If you have a studio, and we don't have to name any names, but you have a studio where the work is really, really good, what typically holds them back from doing what you're talking about? Is it fear of like, well, what, because we're kind of getting a little bit woo-woo here. Is it that they're insecure about their own personality coming out, and kind of letting their freak flag fly? I mean, you don't have to go to extremes, but you don't have to have like skateboards hanging up in the studio, and stuff like that. But you do need to be vulnerable in a way. Is like, am I getting at something here?
Yes, and I will name a name because I'm in Cincinnati right now because I came here. I'm working with the team at Odd Beast, okay, which earlier this year the studio was named Polymath. So earlier this year, when I started working with Ronnie, one of the partners, they were in the process of, we are thinking about rebranding and maybe even changing our name. At the time, it was kind of terrifying. Why? Because you actually have so much to lose. I mean, if you're running a studio of a few people, 5 or 10 people, I mean, these are millions of dollars, and more over years, that if you screw this up, there's a lot at stake. So there's a trepidation. Do we really need to do this? Are we just fixing something that isn't broken? And the answer is, well, yeah, it's not broken, but could it be better? Sure. What's the tipping point? Now, when I saw their potential rebrand, I said, look, for what it's worth, go. Like, that is awesome. Odd Beast, the whole point of view, the angle, I was like, this is so much more true, again, true to the partners who run this studio. They plowed forward, they unleashed it, and man, talk about making a splash. And now they have this brand, this message, this point of view that truly resonates. It's just who they are. So they get to go out and be who they are to the world. So they show up in all kinds of, I don't know, more authentic ways. It's more interesting. It's more compelling. It's like, if I'm a buyer and I resonate with that, I'm like, I want to get on board with that. I want to play with those people and go make awesome stuff. So let's go.
I love that. And, you know, I one of the predictions that that I made in the podcast was that there'd be a lot of rebrands this year, and I wasn't quite sure why. It was just kind of an intuition I had.
Interesting.
But you're kind of naming something that I just had this inkling of, and I also thought that we might see studios getting a little edgier again. I remember this piece. You might remember it. It came out in the early 2000s, and I think it was an opener for like a ad agency battle of the bands or something. And it was some studio, I forget which one, took a bunch of porn clips and edited them together and then cell animated over the naughty bits to make it look like, oh, it's someone playing a flute or it's someone like playing pinball. And there used to be a lot of like really experimental, weird stuff like that. And then, you know, the rough edges get sanded off as you grow and sort of the corporate look of things, especially on the web, kind of became homogenized. And I'm wondering if maybe that's another pendulum that swings the other way. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I am going to agree with you. I think my intuition is similar, that I think in a way what we saw happen maybe in the late 2000s and in the 2010s was studios were growing. And one of the ways that they grew was they took on all types of different work, different skills, different disciplines, different markets, different whatevers. And then in order to maintain that growth, there's a certain, like you said, sanding off of the edges. They round down the corners. They paint things beige because there's this, well, we have to sort of appeal to everybody, which is another way of saying appeal to nobody. That's how it sort of runs its course. And I think there is maybe a returning of being spicy, being provocative, or just, you know, letting your freak flag fly, as you said. And I totally welcome that. I think that's going to be a really cool trend, and I hope it continues.
So, okay. So what we just talked about, it kind of reminds me of the old adage that, you know, and I talk about this whenever I talk about freelancing, is that, you know, people buy from people, right? Now, if they're hiring a studio, you know, they're hiring a group of people. But I also think that your brand, if you have any kind of company, one way of thinking about your company's brand is which celebrity would be a good stand-in for your brand, right? Is it The Rock? Is it Beyonce? Is it, you know, or is it like Ryan Seacrest, just some sort of safe, you know, kind of person? And so is this strategy that you're talking about, is it really just sort of trying to get to that where even if you're a studio with 20 people in it and all different personalities and different interests and things like that, that there's still some sort of thing that everyone's implicitly or not implicitly agreed to? Okay, we are the studio that feels like, you know, I don't know, like pick your favorite stand-up comic, right? Like, because I think one thing that would be helpful for people listening is if you already have a group of 10 people or 6 people and you like this idea, but it's not just you anymore, right? And it's a little hard to just say like, okay, we're going to start being edgy, everybody. There almost needs to be a composite personality to the studio, right?
Oof. Which I'll just be honest here, and this is a hot take here, is I don't think you can position by committee. Okay, I think that's a recipe for beige or whatever that color is when you mix all the colors from the paint kit.
Yeah,
and you're a kid, you mix them all together, and you're like, is that gray, brown? What? I don't know what that is, but it's certainly not interesting. I would say it has to come from the top, because most owners are these really generous people who love building consensus and building teams. And of course, they run this company of all these people. But I will go to an owner and say, look, I know you don't think it's about you, but in a way it is about you. It's always been about you. So don't be afraid to take a strong stand. That's why your team loves you, is because you have certain values, certain beliefs, a certain point of view about the world. That's why everybody's here. So get in touch with that, get really freaking clear about it, and then everyone get on board with it. Let's go.
I want to make sure you know about our in-depth motion design curriculum at School of Motion. We don't just offer classes that you can take anytime. We also offer interactive, guided sessions that go deep into teaching you how to use design and animation software, but more importantly, the principles of good design, animation, illustration, 3D, and much more. You get to learn alongside other artists, and you even get feedback and support from your own personal teaching assistant, a professional motion designer who's part of the School of Motion community. Find out more on our site. The link is in the description. So now let's move into the current year, 2025. And why don't we start with just how are you feeling generally? Are you optimistic? Are you cautiously optimistic? Like, where are you at right now?
Optimistic. Definitely optimistic, because I had this inkling maybe back last summer that I said, I think there's this pent up demand. There's all this uncertainty from the election and other things, that once we get on the other side of that, man, I just sense that things are going to pick up. And I actually put a survey inside my community called Forum. And the survey was simply, what's the trend? If you look at last quarter, this quarter, next quarter, okay, so this is happening back at the end of 24. And the response was, let me look at my numbers, 63% of studios said business and revenue are definitely trending stronger. Okay. So if you look at just like definitely trending stronger or about the same, which was already better than 2023, it's something like 86% are basically saying like business is, good and steady or strong. So I think we've passed some sort of a tipping point. I don't want to be too optimistic because I am absolutely a raging optimist. But
I love that term.
Yeah, overall, I'm quite optimistic for 2025.
Yeah, I am too. Like I've learned this over the years. As goes the industry, goes School of Motion, and we're seeing the same thing. This is basically the beginning of our Q4, and every sign is pointing up and to the right now. And we've rolled out this new B2B program, which has been cool because I get an opportunity to talk to like all of these businesses. And it'd be interesting to compare notes one day, Joel, because I'm talking to probably very different people. I'm talking to the post-production supervisor for Ford, or, a creative group manager at a big agency in Ireland and stuff like that. And I'm asking them these same questions, and I'm asking them what kind of projects are coming up. And they're saying the same things. They're saying like, yeah, it's been really slow the last couple of years. Things are starting to get busy again. We're about to start hiring. And so I'm hoping these are kind of leading indicators, that we are about to hit, at least something that resembles a boom. So having seen these like boom and bust cycles before, what leading indicators do you look at to say like, or what are the signs that you're seeing other than people telling you that they're optimistic and seeing these things? What are the specifics that someone can say like, oh, that's a good sign. Now I feel a little bit better.
Well, there's the obvious signs, like just asking people and saying, what are you seeing? There's also like, I've learned in my career, like what you just shared are these anecdotes, right? Of this big buyer or this brand or this agency or whatever. And if you are listening carefully and you get a handful of anecdotes, what I've found is you don't want to go all in on that and place a bet based on pure anecdotal information, right? Rather than a big sample, we'll call it, of data. But I would say I've learned to go with the evidence rather than against it. And once I start hearing those anecdotes, I start becoming more curious and looking for, is there more evidence that can back that up? And if I continue to find more evidence, I start to form an opinion called, I think this is a trend. I'm not going to, like, again, tell anyone to whatever, make some giant move based on that.
Got to hedge a little bit for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But just based on what you're saying and what I'm saying, I'm like, this is even more evidence. I just heard Joey say A, B, and C. So the other evidences that I'm seeing are things like, I'm thinking of one of my clients who just got awarded their biggest budget job in their history by a factor of about 3. Okay. So just to put a real number to that, that would be like, imagine if your biggest job was $150,000. They got awarded a, what is that, $450,000 job. Okay. Again, very anecdotal, very solo. But you know what? That doesn't just happen randomly. There are market forces behind that. There is a brand that is saying, we're hiring this animation company to promote this product, and we are going to spend $450,000 without batting an eye. Okay. That's a really interesting indicator. The other thing I would say is just the number of inquiries, right? Inbound. Hey, studio, we would love to talk to you about a project, or hey, here's some boards. Can you send us a proposal? These kinds of things, overall. And then I think also just, I've done 13 of my dinners this year, which, by the way, I still haven't gotten you to one of those.
I would love to come. Yeah.
Right. But in those 13 dinners, let's say 15 to 20 founders all getting together in a room. And I've just felt the vibe shifting from the ones I did in January to the one I just did here last night in Cincinnati. That I'll put it, okay, this is a great data point here. In February, I did one in New York. Okay. And Amanda from Cream was there, and Ronnie from what was then Polymath, now Oddbeast, was there. Justin Barnes from Versus was there. I remember asking everybody, go around the table and tell me in one word, what is it you want this year more than anything else? And the most common word that everyone shared was stability.
I was going to guess safety. So, okay, good. Yeah.
Pretty close, right? Pretty close. Now, there were a couple founders there that lost their shit because they were like, are you kidding me? That is not the game you're in. What's interesting is last night here in Cincinnati, I asked the same question. What is it that you want? And only one person said stability. Everybody else said something like, I don't know, that was less safe, less predictable. And I thought even that it's anecdotal, but it's still really interesting that you get a group of owners together. The beginning of this year, everybody wants safety and security. End of the year, people are starting to dream again and let these other desires come out. Like, I want adventure. I want profit. Somebody said last night, I want to play golf more. I mean, let's go. I mean, come on.
That's beautiful, man. I love that. Okay. So let's start getting a little strategic here. So, we started off by talking about, the idea of standing for something, right? And I think that, in a way you could kind of put that in the bucket of finding your niche, finding your lane, so that you're not competing with literally everybody. You're competing with people who are just like you, and really no one's just like you, right? So you're a one of one at that point. But then there's kind of this other thing, and kind of bringing us back to the early 2000s. So my career really started in 2002. So I missed the late 90s. All the older artists I work with would tell me stories about, cocaine at the color grading session and giant boats of sushi. So I missed out on all that fun. But I do remember watching when, After Effects and Final Cut Pro and Premiere started to overtake Avid and Flame and Smoke. And a lot of these legacy companies that had invested millions of dollars in these really expensive tools, and that's how they marketed themselves, they almost all went out of business unless they owned their own building or something. That was really the only ones that were still around in Boston after that. So now we don't really have that dynamic, but it does seem like there is sort of a tool-driven thing happening right now. I obviously, as someone who teaches tools a lot, I focus a lot on the tools, right? I try to have a more holistic view, but sometimes I get in my tunnel and I'm looking at Rive and I'm looking at Unreal and I'm looking at these things. And to me, it seems like there's also a huge opportunity to expand outside of the traditional linear world of motion design that most of us, not all of us, but most of us have been kind of living in for a long time. But that's a totally different thing than what you're talking about, right? And so I'm curious how you see new tools, and specifically Rive, Unreal Engine. Really, those are the two big ones because they kind of open up new avenues, new things you couldn't do before, right? Unreal very clearly competes with VizRT and Chiron, these legacy old systems that cost millions of dollars. And you have to send your people, out to wherever to get trained and stuff. And now Unreal, like you can take a school of motion course, you can get on YouTube. Rive opens up possibilities that literally didn't exist before it was created. I just watched a talk from Marty at Territory Studios about how they're using it for on-set, like interactive UIs for actors and stuff to use. These are things you couldn't really do easily. So how much do you look at sort of those kinds of opportunities, doing new things for new markets that are opened up by technology?
Well, okay, so I'm going to be maybe the yin to your yang here, because from my vantage point in the industry, I don't pay a lot of attention to the tools specifically, okay? Because in terms of how I'm trying to help studios and production companies, I look at those tools as a means to an end, all right? So what I've observed is what wins is curiosity. Okay. Curiosity, meaning those of us who are asking this question, what are the problems out there in the world, especially businesses? What are they trying to solve out there? And how can my passion and my expertise be brought to bear on that? Okay. Now that sort of tells me, wow, in order to solve that kind of problem, I need a tool like Rive. I need a tool, right? Like Cavalry or something. And that's, I think, what is ultimately, it's that idea of you're ultimately trying to produce a result or an outcome in the world. And then the question is, what's the best tool that's going to get me there? Now, to your point, though, the tools are getting incredible and they're doing totally new and interesting things with those tools. So I think that curiosity should extend to what's everybody doing out there. So being curious and just staying in touch with, we're seeing people do things with these tools that even I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, we can do that now? Like for me, I would say one space that I find intensely awesome right now is what I've loosely called experiential. So think of immersive, in real life, pop-ups, events, those kinds of things that have this live component where you're bringing motion designers in. Are they creating motion design? I don't know, because most of it's Unreal or Unity or these other things. If hopefully I'm remembering all the names right. What I find is they're solving problems that I just wouldn't have thought to solve them that way 5 or 10 years ago, because the tools weren't there. And they're being solved in these ways where I see brands signing up and saying, yes, we want that. Yes, we need that. Please help us solve that problem. We didn't even know we could do that. And these are the companies that are busy or booked. And some of these people are booked 6 months, 9 months, a few, even a year out. And I'm like, okay, if I'm running a business, I want to be that guy, right?
What you just talked about, that's really, and I agree with you totally. The customers are not buying motion design, right? They're buying the 1/4-inch hole in the stud. That's what they want. They don't care what the drill is. And so I'm going to ask you to talk to freelancers for a minute, because I think, if you're a studio owner of any size, I think you automatically, just by going through the experience of building a company and a team and having to brand and do all that stuff, you probably have a little bit more of an intuition for this. But for individual artists, I talk about the tools and I rave about them like constantly, but I also try, and sometimes I forget, and I should say this more, when you're selling your services to somebody and you've taken the time to learn Rive and all of those things, right? What Rive can do is create experiences that can't be created in other ways, and those experiences can be valuable to clients. But that's not how freelancers are used to talking about themselves, right?
Sure.
So they almost have to do the same exercise that you have your founders go through. So, if someone's really interested, and I'll use Rive as the example because I think that's the most kind of unique thing out there right now where, and maybe we can play a little like game here. Like the way I look at it is it unlocks the world of web and product design for motion designers to go in there. And what I like about that is, especially in product design, those budgets are not marketing budgets. Those are totally different things, right?
Yeah,
and those projects are not, we're booking you for a month, right? Like a lot of times, If you're doing something for Google or Apple, you're working on it for 18 months, right? But you're not selling, I'm a good Rive artist, right? What are you selling? And how do you think about like the language you use on your site and how you talk about it?
I mean, I'm just going to go back to my former life, okay, when I was running Impossible Pictures, and how freelancers or people that wanted to join my team as a staff person, how they would present themselves. And I think it just starts with empathy. I mean, kind of like everything in life, if you want to be successful, right? Figure out what other people want and need and help them get it. You're going to be successful. So the freelancers that would approach me and say, not, hey, I'm a great, whatever, flame artist, but they would get inside my world or my head enough to say, hey, I can give you something that I think would add a certain, I don't know, tool or weapon in your arsenal that you need to then go to your clients and win that piece of business. So it was sort of understanding, well, what is it that keeps Joel up at night? So if I'm a freelancer, I would be asking, look at those founders, those leaders, those teams that you want to work with, and just ask, what is it that keeps them up at night? And how could my skill, my service with this maybe specific tool bring them something that they really need, and they may not even know they need it, right? Because if you're on that leading edge, you're going to be saying, hey, things like, hey, have you guys thought about adding web such and such to your arsenal so that when you go pitch a brand on, we're going to go do this, whatever launch for you, we're going to also be able to deliver this web component now, because in my back pocket, I've got this Rive expert back here. So I think it's just, again, it's that empathy and following it through. Like, why is this valuable? Why is this studio? Why is this production company going to be more successful, more awesome, more famous, more efficient, whatever it is, because I'm here?
So you brought up an interesting challenge, which is, especially with newer capabilities that artists have, is that clients that need that capability don't know they need it, right?
Right.
And
totally.
so, right, and this it's always kind of, this is the challenge with any kind of new tool. And it seems like historically, if you look at it, it's often driven by artists doing experiments that, kind of catch someone's eye. I mean, I'm thinking of, I think John Lepore did something when the Apple Vision Pro came out with like an F1, like kind of, proof of concept. And that I think it turned into a real thing eventually. Someone saw it and was like, yes, build that for me. And so again, that's another thing that I think a lot of artists, and maybe you disagree. I would think that kind of stuff is almost in some ways easier, but in some ways harder for studios to do, because there's more cost involved. There can be more risk, especially if you're small and you don't have, a year of runway in the bank to sort of fund this R&D project. So how do you, if someone wants to lean into these new capabilities, because that's right now, at least, a fairly straightforward way to differentiate yourself, because not a lot of artists have these capabilities yet, but you need to know how to get it out there that, like, this is a thing I can do. You don't even know that it's possible, but once you see, I know you're going to want it.
Yeah, dude, it's such an interesting point, because when you are selling innovation, yeah, by definition, you are selling something to somebody that they don't know they need. Yeah. So what's the answer? I will just say this. I am not, okay, we're going to call this spec work. All right. But let's put a better spin on it. Let's call it passion projects. Okay.
Rebrand it. Yeah.
Yeah. Spec work is where you're doing something free to try and win a piece of business. Okay. Not my favorite strategy. However, I'm a big fan of passion projects, because I would encourage any studio, and similarly a freelancer or somebody wanting to get a job, to set aside budget. Okay. So look at your annual budget. I know that's a little bit obscure if you're a freelancer, but say for like a studio, I will take a certain amount of profit and say, let's set aside 2%, 3%, 4% this year to do a passion project, R&D, whatever that experimental thing is that we're going to use as one. This is the kind of stuff we freaking love, and we are so freaking passionate about it. We just went and spent a pile of money doing this thing. But it's also going to show people, here's the problem you didn't know you have. And once you see how it can be solved, and John Laporte's example, his F1 thing, everyone should Google that and go check that out on Twitter because it blew up like like crazy.
It went very viral, yeah.
Very viral. And guess what? John was launching his new consultancy or practice called Black Box Infinite. And guess what? The guy comes out of the gate with this huge, viral piece that's got all this attention, and he's getting meetings and conversations with all kinds of people that are saying, wow, what is that? That looks really interesting. We would love to talk about that. So yes, I would say that passion projects, even though I know those are risky, those are investments, but if it's something that you love doing, I had clients always wanted to tell me, Joel, I would love to know, what would you and your team produce if nobody was paying you? If you were making all the decisions, okay, this was Andy at Andy Baker at Disney Plus. And he was like, I want to see the thing that you make when there's no client, there's nobody telling you what to do. You get to make all the decisions. Show me what you were like born to do. And I think that's a really beautiful thought.
I love this. This is almost like a therapy session, And I think a lot of artists could probably use one after the last 2 years.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so
I hear you.
I want to talk about Forum. You've mentioned it a few times, but you've been providing this incredible resource for years, and I've talked about it on this podcast many times. I have a business coach. I've had multiple ones for years, and a lot of people ask me like, should I get a business coach? And I always just say, if you have a business, yes, you need a business coach. And it's not for the reason most people think. I think most people believe that, a business coach tells you what to do because you don't know when they do. And that is maybe in the very beginning, that's partially true, but really it's almost like your confidant. It's the one person you can talk to that understands exactly the anxiety and the stress that you have. So talk a little bit about Forum. Who is it for? Because a lot of people listening to this might think, wow, Joel is brilliant. I'd love to work with him. But I'm just a freelancer, right? So who is it for, and sort of how does it work, and why did you start it?
So yeah, earlier this year, I broke from this consultancy, RevThink, that I had been working with for about 9 years, and said, I'm going to create this new community for founders because I'm a founder and I get the struggles. I understand this journey. Of course, I work as an advisor and I help people one-on-one. But like you said, those are for studios that are several million and can afford, right, that level of coaching and accountability and all that kind of thing. But I also said, man, I want to help and support the 100 best in the world. And so I said, I'm going to start this new community called Forum. And I've done just that. I invited all the best to show up and be part of this community where we as founders and leaders, not everyone's a founder, but founders and leaders can come together. We have discussions. We have weekly live roundtables. We also go through courses every quarter from it's all about the business. It's all about the business side. So I could go down a long list of all these things that some people might find quite boring, such as production and finance and sales and marketing and positioning and all that stuff. But think of it as the resource that these top 100 studios, these founders and these leaders are hanging out together, and they're sharing with each other, and they're connecting with each other, and they're pushing each other forward in ways that you just can't get if you're on your own. And I'm very present there. I have different levels. So if people want access to me and my team, right? So there's all told about 300 people that are members. A bunch of them are sort of in the free version, but the 100, what I call my full members, are the people that are really super engaged. They're showing up and contributing, at least on a weekly basis. And it's really interesting because these people are all competitors, but I like to use the word rivals because they actually very rarely, and I mean very rarely, compete with each other directly. So there's this beautiful, you kind of said it earlier, like you do you. Because if you stay in your lane, you do your thing, there's so much opportunity out there. There's hundreds of thousands of brands, and the chances that we're going to go pitch the same brand are almost zero. So let's just help each other because we're going to, it's the whole rising tide lifts all boats type of a principle. That's what Forum is all about.
Well, I can highly recommend to anyone who is thinking of starting a studio or has started one and you're trying to grow it. And, the black hole sometimes beckons to you. And when you start a business, it can be very difficult. It's unbelievably helpful to have a support group and someone leading it like Joel with as much experience as you have. I wanted to ask you too about, sort of just this is very kind of ground level, but one of the things that I've noticed over the last 2 years for sure, and I've seen this with a couple of very small studios, a lot of freelancers do this, but it seems like there's this feeling that marketing yourself and doing sales may have changed a little bit. And, my thing has always been like, get good at the basics, okay? Learn how to build rapport, learn how to find out who the person at the company you want to work with, what their name is, and find out some things about them, and reach out in a very friendly way, not asking for anything. In fact, try to give them something and play the long game and build rapport and maybe go meet with them. And eventually when the right opportunity comes up, they'll think of you and they'll book you, right? But then I've seen a lot of people have a lot of success with going viral or, just being kind of an influencer and making lots of cool videos and stuff like that. So what is working from a marketing and sales perspective right now for your clients?
Okay, great question. I would say it's not the going viral thing. Not that doesn't work. Okay. But to me, that's the strategy I call, I'm going to go make a hit record.
Right. It's not scalable. Yeah.
Right. It's not scalable. It's not repeatable either. Right. If you look at the strategies that most people that quote go viral or become an influencer or whatever, it's extremely chaotic and subject to all kinds of market whims and luck and all other kinds of things. What I find is a better strategy, and this is especially true for studios, is those timeless classic principles. It's the journey that we often talk about of moving people from no to like to trust, right? So one thing first of all, is kind of a hot take that I'll put out there is this is not popular, okay? But I'm going to say that remote work is damaging a lot of people's careers.
I think that's clear now. Yeah.
There's this very slippery slope that people will often say, yeah, but you can work from anywhere nowadays. And I would say that is absolutely true. However, there's a myth tied up in that called, if you sit at home behind your computer in whatever, the upper regions of Saskatchewan, you'll be just as successful as the person in New York City. And that's a total lie. I know. There's people going, you can't say that. Okay. But I would just say, yes, you can work from anywhere, but you still have to be willing to travel and get out in the real world and hang out with real people in real life, or you won't have an exceptional career. So I'm sorry. I know that is really frustrating to some people when they hear that. I was taught also there's these referability habits. And I have to give credit to Dan Sullivan, who heads the strategic coach, because he was my entrepreneurial coach back 20 years ago. And one thing he taught me was, he said, Joel, if you do these 4 things, you will be referred and be busy for the rest of your life. You ready? I'm like, yeah, give it to me. He goes, okay, they're really simple. Number 1, show up on time. Number 2, do what you say you're going to do. Number 3, finish what you start. And number 4, say please and thank you. He goes, if you freaking get serious about doing those fundamentals that have always, always, always worked, you will be infinitely referred. And I just took him at his word and started practicing those habits, and they have served me so well. And I don't see those going away anytime soon.
That's really good to hear, because I think that it can feel a little bit like you're on this endless treadmill if you're constantly trying to keep up and you see someone else, getting lots of work from Instagram or something, and you don't even have an Instagram account. That the basics they're probably here forever. People are people. I would say, and you can respond to this. I might put an asterisk next to what you said about you can live in Saskatchewan and be just as successful as someone in New York. That's a myth, right? And I would say that's definitely true if you're earlier in your career and you're trying to, you're trying to be a freelancer from there and work with all the same studios, yes, like theoretically you can. It is much, much, much harder to get work from people that have never met you and don't have anything in common with you. If you live in New York City or you live in Saskatchewan, you probably have very different lives. And so now maybe if you've had a 20-year career and then you start a family and you move out there and now your network is huge, you can continue that, right? It might be harder to kind of keep progressing, but maybe you don't want to at that point, right? Do you think that is true, or do you think, okay, there we go.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And that's I think often the reason that the myth pervades is because we look at examples of people who are in the far reaches living, on a remote island in Tahiti, and they're super successful. But if you look at how they got there, okay, that's the thing. Be really curious. When you look at a studio that you admire, when you look at a freelancer or a director or whoever that's super successful, don't imitate what they're currently doing. Imitate how they got there. And I bet, to your point, you're going to find a lot of people spent several years in LA, several years in New York, several years in London, and they built up this killer network. They built up this rapid learning by being in the trenches with those other artists, with those other creatives, with those clients. And then, sure, after 10 years, they said, hey, I'm going to go hang out on my remote island in Tahiti. And you're right. They can be super successful because they built that network.
Yeah, I think it's, I love the funnel of you. They know you, they like you, they trust you, and finally they book you. Yes. Trust is the one. I mean, it's hard to, you can make someone like you if you're really, if you give good phone or good Zoom. I love that term. It's really hard to make people trust you implicitly where you're their first call if you've never met them in person. It is very difficult.
Yeah, I was having dinner with a guy from Showtime and Paramount Plus in New York just a few weeks ago, and he was talking about, I can't even explain it, but when I'm hanging out with that studio principal and we're having a beer and we're just shooting the shit and doing all that thing, he said, I don't know why, but I'm calling them the next week to award them that job, even though I've got 3 other people bidding. The one that I had the beer with gets the work. It just, I don't know how to explain it.
I love that. The one I had the beer with gets the work. I'm going to put that on a t-shirt.
Yes.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Okay, cool. I wanted to ask you about some specific things that you said when you sent in your answers for the end of the year podcast, because you're really good at this. And I don't know if you wrote that stuff out ahead of time, but you say these things that are so quotable. You just it just sounds like you should put it on a mug or something. So one thing you said was that, and I called it out already, but I'd like to elaborate a little bit. Forget about motion design as a service. Shift from an order taker to an expert. Now, what does that mean?
Oh, man. Okay, here's the context. Think about how each of us grew up. We grew up being nice little boys and girls in school, and then we went to college, and then we got the resume, and then we went through the interview process, and then we got the job. And what are we doing? We're following orders all the freaking time. We've been inculcated and trained and programmed. Okay. Like I'm thinking of Pink Floyd, The Wall. I mean, this mindset called, if you follow the rules, you win. Okay. And then one day you get into this business that we're in. And especially if you start your own business and you realize that runs its course, that being the order taker is a life of being reactive rather than one of intention and proactivity. So we have to make this shift. And for most small studios, that I work with and I'm trying to move them forward, I'm trying to get them out of that mindset of stop waiting, stop looking, waiting for permission, stop, waiting for the client to call you and say, I've got this project, can you bid on it? And start shifting to this curious thing I call the expert, which is you show up and you see the problems because you can diagnose them and you identify them. And then you see solutions, like we talked about earlier, that other people don't even see. And this shift puts you in a place where your clients and the people that buy from you, they love to follow your lead because you're going to take them to places they didn't know they could go. And guess what? That's really valuable in the modern world. Like, oh, you can help me solve that problem and generate that return on that investment, okay, whatever that thing is, that's huge. And plus, let's face it, as creative people, we create. We have this initiative and drive within us to make and create. That's not inherently an order taker thing. That is we love this idea of being independent and having agency and doing that thing that we feel called to do. So becoming the expert is part of this journey that I want everybody to embrace, because I think it leads to just a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
So that just brought up a question that I haven't really pondered before. And maybe you have. So, because what you're talking about there, it's kind of like a cousin of niching down or having your own kind of personality, right? Like you're not saying, I think you said this earlier, yes, we can do that. Like whatever it is, yes, we can. It's more like, this is what I do. Maybe it's not for you, but if it is, go try to find someone else who can do it, because they're not out there, right? And I think that, especially for someone earlier in their career and maybe just started a studio, that's very scary, because it seems like you're really limiting the pool of possible clients. And what you really want is to be able to take any client at any time, and because that's how you get the most money and stability and safety and all that. How many clients does a small studio, let's say there's a studio with 6 people, how many clients do you really need to feel safe and to be, because I think there might be this perception like you need 100, right? And so if I really niche down, maybe there's only 20 out there in the whole world, but maybe you only need 20. So I'm curious if you've ever thought about that.
Yes, okay. Love that thinking, by the way. And I actually have a answer ready to go, because I did a loose, I don't want to call it a study, but I looked into this years ago, and what I discovered was studios tend to have 10 to 12 clients.
There it is.
And there it is. Now, here's what's weird. They don't really, okay, I'm going to say 10 to 12 good clients, big clients. Okay. So if you look at like the sales for any given year, you're going to find that there's about 10 to 12 clients that are the ones that you would say, those are the ones that matter. Those are the ones that are sustaining our business. It's not going to be 20 or 30 or 4. It's certainly not going to be 100. Okay. But it's also not 1 or 2, because that's so risky, right? That's what we call a whale client or a gorilla client, right? If they go away, your business is sunk. So those businesses aren't even around to add to the statistics.
I've seen it.
Yep. Right? Yeah, we've totally seen it and lived it. So yeah, it's 10 to 12. And my overall encouragement would be this. I think for the smaller shops that on your way to 1 million, I get it. You're just taking whatever you can get. You're trying to grow and get enough revenue that you can hire some people, expand your offering, and be in business. And that's fine. But then it runs its course. And as you sort of cross over from 1 million and beyond, you do have to start doing this thing called be picky, be choosy, be niching down, be selective, because that's actually what's going to propel your next season of growth, ironically. This is what happened when I was running Impossible. Was we got to about 2 million, I think, by sort of being we do it all. And it started to come back to bite us in the ass. And that's when I said, we're going to change our name to simply Impossible. And we're going to double down and go after branding and design. And this was a very niching down for us. And my team, they were all like, I'm polishing my resume because this is the craziest idea in the world. They thought we should expand our offering even more. And I said, nope, we're going to go deep, right? Rather than wide. And it worked. We grew to about 5 million over the next few years, and we did lots of rebrands of TV networks and that kind of stuff. And it was a lot more fun. So yeah, there's something very beautiful about becoming a lot more focused. But don't think of it, just to be caution anyone, when I say focus and niching down, I don't mean a discipline or a skill. Like, oh, you mean I'm supposed to focus only on 3D and not 2D? No. Think about you're going to be focusing and niching down on either a vertical or a horizontal. And you can Google those terms, but vertical is like a category in the industry like automotive or packaged goods or whatever. A horizontal is more like, what are the needs that transcend all verticals? So soccer moms, okay, could be a horizontal, or comedy could be a horizontal. When you start thinking about focusing on something like that, it's really fun because you can do 2D and 3D and live action and be the world's best comedy studio. So that's more of the thinking there.
I love that. Okay, so there was something else you said. There's two more things I wanted to ask you about. So you said that some studios are learning to, quote, derail the pitch. And, everyone listening probably knows what a pitch is. And, we've talked about it on this show. I mean, like, some people see it as kind of a necessary evil. It's the cost of doing business. Some people are like, I will not do an unpaid pitch. What does derailing the pitch mean?
Okay. So, first of all, I'm going to say for people that hate pitching and don't want to do it, I would say more power to you. That's great. And for people who say, no, I want to pitch because I want to win those projects and grow my business and that, I would say, awesome, let's go. Okay. So to each his own. I give them permission. The derailing the pitch is this idea that when you enter into an RFP, a pitch, a tender, okay, whatever, an RFQ, there is always a favorite. And if you are the third bid, we call it the dreaded third bid, all right, you're going to lose. You're almost always going to lose. And so your job when you derail a pitch is how can I take control in clever ways of this process to find out if I'm the favorite or if I'm the third bid, because that's really important information as I go through this process, because that's going to tell me whether or not I'm investing days or weeks or months of time and energy or money in this pitch. And it's a mindset. It's a mindset that's more like, hey, I'm this priceless, amazing thing. And this client would be so lucky to work with me and for me to come in and solve their problem. So I'm going to smoke them out and I'm going to essentially test their responsiveness, because the more that I put up slight objections or I'm unable to accommodate that, or I can't do these things, or we have this policy that only allows us these kinds of things, to the extent that they say, okay, we can deal with that, is their way of saying, we want you to win. To the extent that they say, oh, that's not going to work for us, right? Or sorry, those are the rules. You have to play by them. To the extent that they put up those red flags, they are telegraphing to you and saying, we don't care if you bow out, Joey, because you're not going to win anyways. So this was a method that, again, this is after 20, 30 years of pitching history.
Learned this the hard way, I bet.
I learned this the hard way. Yeah, big time. Right. And again, having worked with hundreds of studios also, I collapsed this all down because about a year and a half ago, I was working with 3 different studios that all lost really big pitches. And when I asked them, why do you think you lost? Their answers really frustrated me, because they were like these pansy, wimpy things like, oh, we should have put concept 2 before concept number 1 in our deck. I'm like, right. What? You think that? And when I challenged them and said, what if you were always the third bid? Always. Like you were going up against PSYOP in the mill. I'm sorry, but you were always the third bid. And this was when I said, I can't take it anymore. I got to teach these concepts to all these folks. And that's what now is what I collectively call Derail the Pitch. And there's a whole course and everything that we go through in Forum. And it's been super fun to see people sort of regain their position of power in the pitch process. And it leads to better outcomes, because you're either winning that thing and getting top dollar for it, or you're stepping off, bowing out early, or just not over investing in the sale.
Yeah. So real quick, Joel, just because I bet a lot of people listening aren't aware of sort of the internal mechanics of agencies and when they ask people to pitch. Why are they asking a company to pitch if they have no intent of hiring them?
Well, part of it is that sometimes it's just a requirement, right? Certain corporations.
That's what I always ran up against. Yeah. Like we have to ask 3 people.
Yeah, that's a common thing, right? And this is, let's not get into why. Let's just say that that's a thing. It's a requirement. We have to get 3 bids. Okay. So that translates into 3 submissions to this RFP. So that's one reason why. The other reason is that sometimes people mean well, like they really do, okay, here's PSYOP and here's the mill and then there's your studio. And they genuinely say, yeah, let's see what they come up with. And yes, there's a chance that they might award it to that third bid studio. But let's just say that it's such a long shot. It's like would you bet your future on a 1% chance of winning? Like, no. So you've got to either figure out how to increase your odds or just not play that game.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay. All right. So one more thing you said, and I suspect this might be a somewhat long answer, but I think you were talking about what artists and studios can do in 2025 to stand out and to be successful. And you said they should learn to speak brand. What does that mean?
What does that mean? Okay. So for anyone that listens, right? Anyone that knows me or listens to my podcast and that stuff, is I'm a big proponent of what I'm going to call going brand direct, right? I know most people in the industry, most studios, right? You either work for a studio or the studios work for advertising agencies. They work for entertainment companies and so forth. And these are buyers that have historically bought from us because they know how to buy from us. They buy quickly. They pay quickly. It's kind of an easy sales cycle. But those markets are shrinking. Won't go into why, but they're shrinking and they're becoming more and more challenged and more noisy. Plus there's more studios and everybody competing in that space. So the great untapped potential of our time is this thing called brand direct, meaning you're not going to go to the agency that works for the brand. You're just going to go right to the brand directly. They might have an internal agency. They might have an in-house creative services. You might just go right to the CMO and work directly for the CMO. This is complicated. It takes more time. It's a lengthier sales cycle, but the rewards are that you end up winning a piece of business where you have more control, you have more influence. You're probably getting more money because you're doing multiple projects. Once you win that client, they are going to engage you for years. So this is the opportunity. So what does it mean to speak brand? This is a term that I've been riffing on with Kevin Rapp. Okay. If anybody knows Kevin Rapp, where you have to understand your audience. You have to speak their language. And what you know is if you go inside of a big brand and you hang out with the people in the marketing or the advertising or product or whatever, they actually speak different than you and me. And we have to learn that language. It's akin to if you were an evangelist and you were going to go preach the gospel to the tribes in the jungle, that you would learn their language to show up and tell them the good news. It's the similar thing of like, if we're going to go into brands, we need to be able to talk to them using their language. And that's what I call speaking brand. So that's the short version, Joey.
Got it. Thank you for that. Yeah. And I mean, I'm just trying to think of some examples. I mean, are you talking about just literally the terminology that they use is different than someone who, runs a studio and is hiring you as a freelancer, and they know what After Effects is, and they know, they say motion design, they say 3D. When you're talking to someone at Bose or Boeing or Buick, that's not what they're saying. Is that kind of part of it?
Right. It's part of it. Yeah. The terminology is certainly part of it. I would say it's also overall again, it comes back to empathy. It's an understanding of what is it that keeps them up at night and what is it that moves them forward. And I think when you start to hang out with marketeers, you start to realize, oh, I didn't know that's what moved the needle for them. It's the way you realize, oh, it's no longer about the 30-second spot that's everyone's going to talk about around the water cooler the next day after the Super Bowl or something. It's now thinking about how do we create content that is, first of all, probably that can be easily replicated and versioned times 1,000 different screen sizes and formats and platforms. It's thinking about how can we toolkit things so that an internal agency can take all these assets that we create and do all of that versioning and stuff for social and that sort of stuff. So it's really just thinking like if you were a large brand, rather than we're just going to create this really cool, sexy thing and it's going to go out there in the world and do something. It's getting inside their heads and understanding how they think in this much more modern and varied and complex world that we live in.
I love that. All right. Well, Joel, last question here. And I always try to, especially when I'm talking to someone like you, I always try to leave people with something actionable that they can do. And, I think probably the The most impactful thing that you've said so far in this conversation, to me anyway, is the idea of kind of finding your lane, finding your voice, standing for something, right? And, I think, probably primarily the people that are listening to this are on staff somewhere, they're freelance, there are studio owners that listen too. And I think there's a version of that for everybody. Even if you're on staff somewhere, I still think there's probably a version of that. But I think for a lot of people, it's really hard. I'm going to go on a tangent here for a minute. So one of my business coaches that I worked with for years, I would come to him and I would explain some very stressful situation. Then I have to make a decision. I don't know what to do. And rather than tell me what he thought, he would always ask me this question: what do you want? And that is the hardest question on earth to answer. And I think this might be a close second. Who are you, right? Like what do you stand for? So do you have any tips, any exercises, any books, anything like that you could recommend to people that can help them answer that question for themselves?
Well, I'm gonna repeat a quote that I love that has become somewhat famous from Kevin Kelly, which is, "Don't be the best, be the only." And it's a really interesting thought when you realize, oh, but wait a minute, my whole life, my whole career, I've been doubling down on this, like, be the best at something. And the idea of be the only is, I think, in a nutshell, what we're getting at. What would be my actionable item? I would say that when I take people through this exercise, okay, that I call carve out your positioning, it's a process that is what I call spending 6 to 12 weeks of navel gazing, because it is trying to answer that question: who are you? And it's also adding maybe a secondary question: and why should I care? Okay,
right.
It's really, really hard to answer that in a sentence. Okay, in a maybe even a shorter than a sentence, in a tagline. All right. But my tip would be, first of all, look at your tagline. Okay. Your one-liner, as Donald Miller calls it, meaning what's the thing below your LinkedIn profile, okay, that says artist or animator, or it says I am a commercial director, okay, whatever that thing is. My tip is, I call it A to the. Take that little word A in that sentence and change it to the word the, and try it on for size. And what you're going to find is it doesn't work. Because when you say something like, we are a studio that is passionate and design driven and super collaborative, you change that word to the, it doesn't make any sense. We are the studio that is, right? So your journey is make that sentence work. Really sit down and think about, if we were going to say we are the, or I am the, okay, fill in the blank. What is the thing that you're going to say? And don't be afraid to be spicy and sticky and weird and odd, because this thing is simply the conversation starter. So your goal is always simply to create curiosity that creates a conversation. That's it. You're not answering everything, end all, be all. You're just getting me hooked. You're just inserting yourself into my brain so that I say, huh? Tell me more. That's the start of this journey.
Oh my God, that man is very, very good. Thank you so much, Joel, for coming on and sharing so much wisdom, and for being such an awesome resource for studio founders in our industry. You can find out more about Joel and his program at joelpilger.com, and he also hosts a podcast called The Fabulist, which you can find on any podcast platform. I personally took a lot away from this conversation, and I hope you did too. If you're thinking of starting a studio, or even if you're a freelancer looking to differentiate this year, there was a lot to think about in this one. So that's it for this episode. If you dug it, make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss any of the amazing guests that we have lined up for this year. 2025 is going to be a banger, I promise. All right, I'll see you next time.